Hey everyone, this is Timothy Luke with the first ever video for GnomeSequencer-Enhanced 2.0. So GSE evolved very quickly, and it was basically a whole lot of feedback where people said, can you get it to do this, and can you get it to do this, and can you get it to add this, and build this, and add this. And very rapidly there were all these pieces that were bolted together, and they didn't really quite fit exactly right. The way people wanted to do things compared to what we had to do as code constraints and limitations. So I've spent the last 6 weeks, so pretty much from about November 1 is when I started, threw out the entire code base and started rewriting from scratch. So I rewrote it with the view that people wanted to do things in-game first and foremost. They didn't want to have to deal with versions, they didn't want it to be messy, they didn't want to be clunky, they wanted to go to one place, do stuff and move on. So this is the first video preview of GSE 2. It's available on Curse now. If you look for GSE in Curse and go to other files, you'll see there's a GSE 2 beta, and that's what I'm using right now. So this will probably be released early in January. Why early in January? Because I'm still got 2 weeks of crazy work where I'm doing 16-17 hour days. I'm not going to be around, and I don't want to release this thing when I can't be about to answer questions, troubleshoot problems, whatever else. But if you want to get a good head start and a good look, this is how it is. So your GS command now just basically brings up this viewer that basically gives you a list of your different mods. So the ones with the blue book, there's no icon that's been created for them in the macros, but the ones with the red book, with the red question mark, you can literally just drag the icon off onto your toolbar and use. You don't have to go /macros, it's just drag the icon. Same with this one, it's just create icon, drag it, and off you go. So there used to be a bunch that were called DB macros that were basically Drake's bundled ones thrown together. I've replaced them with a series called SAM macros, so they're SAM for sample. I'll show you how to load those in a little bit of time. They're bundled with the mod, but they're not just loaded in by default. So GSE won't just fill up your macros tab any longer with the 1,000 odd macros that you happen to load in. It's literally waiting for you to go to either create icon or delete icon. Then it'll add it into the macros thing behind the scene, but you can just drag straight off and straight into your menu thing. So editing and creating new macros is a little bit different. So you've still got the new button. The edit button is a little bit different. So if I go edit, you've now got a couple of tabs. You've got the sequence name, you've got the icon that's shown there. But this is the changes for the help stuff. So you've got your specialization class drop down. Your talent information is just the talent stuff. What I want to do with this later on is basically press a button so that you can have a button here to go change talents, and it'll change to that talent set. There's going to be a little bit of work we've got to go through to do that. Help information, help link. If there's no help link, it'll basically put a link to WoW Lazy Macros. But then these 4 text boxes are where things are different. They're saying default version, raid, mythic, and PvP. So what you've got is that there's one version of this macro called version 1, and that's tab 1. But what you can do with this now is you can take this macro and you could create another version of it that you want to use just for raiding. You have another version just for mythics, another version just for PvP. And when you flag up, or you enter a mythic dungeon, or you enter a raid, it will change the buttons to that particular version. So you don't have to have a PvP version, I've got to drag all my buttons around, a raid version, I've got to drag all my buttons around. You can have the one macro and have the 4 versions in it. And it literally is as simple as going new. Okay, I've got this one. I don't know anything about druids, but I'm going to take these 2 lines out so that they don't happen anymore. I've now got version 2. If I go back to so I've now got my version 2. Go back to config. I can change the raid version to version 2. And what will happen now is that once I save this, when I go into a raid, it'll change to version 2 of this macro. But when I leave the raid, or I do mythics or PvP, it'll still save as version 1. Right, so if you have a look at the Ret Paladin macros, there's Teal's Ret macro. It's set up like this now, and it's sitting on the forums. So it's basically set up where I've got 3 versions of it. I've got one version that's normal, one version for raids and mythic, and I use another version for PvP. So the PvP one adds in Hands of Hindrance. The raid and mythic ones take out Avenging Wrath and those other bits. But I don't have to do anything to activate the separate versions. All I've got to do is zone. As soon as I zone in, it'll change. As soon as I flag PvP, it'll change to if there's a PvP one. So in the old version, you used to have to go through a whole lot of rigmarole to delete versions. Now it's just literally a case, I'll change this back to version 1. Here's version 2, delete version, and it's gone. The new will copy whatever your default is. So if, in this case, default's 1. If default was 2 and I hit new, it would copy that as a starting point, so you don't have to edit from scratch. Save, full, and close. That's pretty much the editing side of it. It's easy for deleting a version. Deleting a macro, I'll take the Sambuma one. You go edit, delete, and it will delete. So it can't be undone, but it's gone. It's deleted the icon. It's cleaned all that stuff up, and it's gone. So one of the other changes for that stuff is that if we go into the options, if I go to plugins, I've now got these buttons that tell me what macros are installed. So if I hit the samples button, there's all the macros that are in samples. There's all the high performance ones. There's the legacy GSE1 stuff. If I want to get that macro back and I know that it was a sample one, I can go to samples, click the button, and it will reload the sample ones. It'll tell me that there's a bunch of collisions down the bottom here. It's basically saying that I've already got those macros. But if I go back to the list, I close this and reopen it. There's Sambuma back again. So it's reloaded in, but not going to load in every time I load. It's not going to happen every single moment. It's just going to happen on the odd occasions of stuff. You've got the other stuff, like you've got your record macro, you've got your sending to somebody in game. Importing now is literally, it pops up its own box. There's 2 toggle boxes. If you're importing an old macro, you'll need to switch it to the legacy GSE1 macros. Otherwise, your GSE2 macros, it'll just import in. The thing is that macro storage is now tied per class. So there's a bunch of macros that are Druid macros. And if I import another macro and it's not a GSE2 macro, it'll import into the Druid set. So I'll have to go and edit it and change it to move it across to the other set by changing its spec ID. But what it means is you can now have multiple macros of the same name. So like you could have a macro called interrupt and put that on your global macros tab, and you could have a different implementation of that. So you could have a Paladin version that did Rebuke. You could have a Druid version that did Solar Beam. You could have whatever else, but you could have them all stored in your library, all called the same thing. But because they're all stored based on class, they're not going to infect each other. But you can have the one global macro called interrupt. You could drag, and it'll call whichever macro underneath. So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that you can do now. Exporting. So if I click this one again and go export, it spits out. You'll notice the format's different, and I'll come back to that. Pre-macro and key press have changed. Step function has changed. It's now just sequential or priority. And the way these work, if I go into edit, if I go back to edit for a sec, so key press and key release are what you used to know as pre-macro and post-macro. So it's literally a case of these things happen every time you press a button. It'll do key press, it'll then do the appropriate line, and then it'll do key release. And it does that every time you press. So you press once, it'll do target enemy, cast Moonkin form, cast Solar Beam, cast Sunfire, then anything that's in the key release, in this case nothing. Then next key press, target enemy, Moonkin, Solar Bear, Moonfire. Next key press, it'll go on a combat surge. Pre-macro works differently. Pre-macro says, I want to run these things, and I want to run them as a one-off, then I want to run the sequence. Now, if I've set a loop limit here, like say I've set this as 5, it will do the pre-macro once, it'll do this 5 times, either sequentially or priority, and then it will do the post-macro afterwards. If I don't set a loop limit, it'll do the pre-macro, then it'll do the normal stuff, and it'll do the normal stuff forever. So where this is useful, if you've got an Arcane Mage and you wanted a macro for Arcane Familiar, you could put Arcane Familiar in the pre-macro, no loop limit, it would cast Arcane Familiar once, and then for the entire rest of your fight, it would never cast it again. I think there's a Shaman thing that's a totem that you want to cast once on a target, and then you never want to cast it again. Well, that's where this stuff on the side here comes into play. You can now do a reset on target, and you can do a reset on combat. Now these grey ticks mean use the defaults that are in GSE. A yellow tick means absolutely do it. An empty box means absolutely don't do it. So at the moment, like, you could use your head slot, neck, belt, ring 1, ring 2, trinket 1, trinket 2. This is calling down to your GSE options, but you could turn around and go, for this macro, I absolutely don't want to use my trinkets, and I don't want to use my rings. But for other versions of this, I do, so leave them alone. So you can override that stuff. But yeah, this reset target with a pre-macro means that for that shaman totem that is a one-off cast per target, you put the shaman totem in here, no loop limit, and then reset target, and then when your target changes, it would basically recast that totem and then continue with the rest of your macro. You may have something that you may want to run the inside of this thing, and you may want to run it 9 times. So inner loop limit 9, and then it'll do your pre-macro. So pre-macro 9 times, post-macro type stuff. Apart from that, you've got the send interface to send a macro to somebody in game. All the exporting stuff will actually export now. I hit the help button. The exporting stuff will actually all export in English. It won't export in Russian, German, or whatever else. And it's more for the case where you've got somebody that's playing in French can send a macro to someone playing in Spanish, and you don't all have to have the translator. So like that translator mod, you don't need that anymore. It's just bundled in and does what it needs to do. You don't need to add it as a separate download. You don't have to reconfigure it. You don't have to think about it. The format of this stuff has changed. You'll notice like step function, sequential, ring 1, ring 2, trinket 1, trinket 2. These are the overrides that we just put in to basically say, no, definitely don't use these on that kind of stuff. If I'd left target as anything but the default, you'd have target equals and combat equals as true and false. You got macro versions, default of 1. So basically that default says to use this version all the time. On one of these ones that's got a couple of versions, you'll see that it basically does 1, 2, 3, and spits the whole lot out. And that's that. That's literally GSE2. It's a ton of work. It's a ton of stuff in behind the background. It's aimed to basically get rid of a whole lot of quirks and annoyances and to make things bit. One of the bits you don't have all the version stuff from the past, so you don't get 50,000 versions when you do minor edits, but you also don't get the ability to roll back anymore. But the trade-off, I think, is reasonable. Deleting a macro is a little bit easier than it was. It's just literally a case of selecting the macro, edit, delete, and it'll delete the whole lot and all of it set up and everything else. But apart from that, I wish you all a Merry Christmas, a great New Year. Obviously, please don't drink and drive. If you're drinking, get someone else to drive, or stuff, all that other fun, fairy, mischief stuff. I hope all of your drops are legendary, and we'll see you later on. Have a great year.